Deline Holloway was born and raised in Cordova. From a young age, she was known for her fervent devotion to the church and her unwavering faith. However, those closest to her knew that beneath her pious exterior lay a troubled soul, scarred by a childhood marred with abuse and neglect. Deline's father, Reverend Borgard, was a fire and brimstone preacher who ruled his household with an iron fist and a leather belt. Her mother, a meek and submissive woman, turned a blind eye to her husband's cruelty, finding solace in prescription pills and fermented fruit juice. Young Deline learned early on that the only way to survive was to lose herself in the pages of the Bible, finding comfort in its words and crafting her own interpretations of its teachings. At the age of 18, Deline met Ezekiel Holloway, a strapping young man who had moved to Cordova from Montgomery to apprentice at the local auto shop. Ezekiel was everything her father was not: kind, gentle, and patient. They married within a year, much to the chagrin of Reverend Borgard, who viewed Ezekiel as an outsider, unworthy of his daughter. Ezekiel Holloway was a simple man with simple dreams. He worked hard, loved his wife, and wanted nothing more than to build a good life for his family. When Deline gave birth to their son Jeremiah, Ezekiel's world was complete. He doted on the boy, teaching him everything he knew about cars and the value of honest work. Jeremiah Holloway grew up in the shadow of his mother's intensity and his father's expectations, a quiet and introspective child. He often found himself caught between his mother's religious fervor and his father's practical approach to life. As he entered his teenage years, Jeremiah struggled with his own faith, questioning the rigid beliefs that had been instilled in him since birth. The Holloway household was a study in contrasts. Deline's zealotry often clashed with Ezekiel's more relaxed approach to religion, while Deline insisted on strict adherence to biblical teachings, often quoting scripture at the dinner table. Ezekiel preferred to show his faith through good deeds and honest living. As Jeremiah grew older, the tension in the house became palpable. Deline's attention increasingly focused on her son, scrutinizing his every move and decision. She saw in him the purity and devotion she believed her husband lacked. Ezekiel, for his part, grew concerned about the intensity of Deline's relationship with Jeremiah, but chalked it up to a mother's love and her religious upbringing. Little did anyone know that the seeds of tragedy had already been sown. The complex dynamics of the Holloway family, shaped by generations of trauma, misguided faith, and unspoken desires, were about to explode in a way that would leave the entire town of Cordova reeling. The stage was set for a drama of biblical proportions, one that would test the limits of faith, family, and morality. The roots of Deline's descent into madness and sin can be traced back to her tumultuous childhood. The scars left by her father's abuse and her mother's neglect ran deep, shaping her understanding of love, family, and faith in profound and disturbing ways. As a child, Deline had learned to dissociate from the pain of her father's beatings by immersing herself in Scripture. She would recite verses in her head, finding solace in the words of prophets and apostles. But as she grew older, her interpretations of these sacred texts began to twist and warp, shaped by her trauma and her desperate need for love and acceptance. Deline's obsession with biblical texts intensified after Jeremiah's birth. She saw her son as a gift from God, a pure vessel untainted by the sins of the world. As Jeremiah grew from a child into a young man, Deline's focus on him became increasingly intense and unsettling. She began to draw parallels between her relationship with Jeremiah and the stories she read in the Old Testament. The tale of Lot and his daughters particularly fascinated her. In her warped logic, she saw their actions not as a sin, but as a divine duty to preserve their lineage. She convinced herself that in times of great need or higher purpose, even the most taboo acts could be sanctioned by God. Deline's misinterpretation of Scripture didn't stop there. She fixated on passages that spoke of the special bond between mothers and sons, twisting their meanings to justify her growing obsession. In her mind, her love for Jeremiah was the purest form of devotion, a reflection of God's love for humanity. As Jeremiah entered his late teens, Deline's feelings toward him began to shift from maternal to something far more sinister. She found herself lingering when he emerged from the shower, her eyes tracing the contours of his body. She imagined running her fingers through his hair, not as a mother comforting a child, but as a lover caressing her beloved. At first, Deline was horrified by these thoughts. She spent hours on her knees praying for forgiveness, begging God to cleanse her mind of these impure desires. But as time went on, her prayers changed. Instead of asking for these feelings to be taken away, she began to ask for a sign that her love for Jeremiah was part of God's plan. In her desperation, Deline began to see signs everywhere. A sermon about Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac became, in her mind, proof that a parent's love for their child could transcend conventional morality. A chance encounter with Jeremiah in a dimly lit hallway, where their bodies briefly touched as they passed, was interpreted as divine approval. Deline's behavior became increasingly erratic. She insisted on homeschooling Jeremiah for his final year of high school, claiming that she needed to protect him from the corrupting influences of the outside world. In reality, drove him forward. One fateful afternoon, Ezekiel returned home earlier than usual. The house was eerily quiet, with only the soft hum of the air conditioning breaking the silence. He called out for Deline and Jeremiah, but there was no response. His unease deepened, a knot forming in his stomach as he moved through the house, room by room. When he reached Jeremiah's bedroom, the door was slightly ajar. A quiet murmur came from inside, followed by a sound that made Ezekiel's blood run cold. Deline's voice, low and tender, saying words that no mother should ever say to her son. Ezekiel pushed the door open, his heart pounding in his chest. What he saw shattered his world in an instant. Deli, her nightgown slipping off her shoulders, stood too close to Jeremiah, who looked pale and defeated. The moment froze in time, a tableau of betrayal and horror. Ezekiel's voice, hoarse and broken, cut through the suffocating tension. What in God's name is happening here? Deline turned, her eyes wide and wild, as if she had been caught in the middle of a sacred act. But instead of guilt or shame, there was a twisted sense of righteousness in her gaze. Ezekiel, you don't understand. This is God's will. We are chosen. Jeremiah, on the verge of tears, couldn't meet his father's eyes. He stammered, trying to explain, to justify, but no words came out. The weight of his shame was unbearable. Ezekiel, his mind reeling, stumbled backward out of the room, disbelief and fury surging through him. His entire world, the family he had built, the wife he had loved, the son he had raised, had crumbled into something grotesque and unrecognizable. In a blind rage, Ezekiel stormed out of the house, his vision blurred by tears. The storm that had been threatening for months had finally broken, and there was no going back. He drove aimlessly through the back roads of Cordova, his mind racing with the dark reality that had unfolded before him. The final act of the Holloway tragedy was now in motion. When Ezekiel returned home later that night, the confrontation would be inevitable. He could never look at Deline the same way again, and Jeremiah's future was forever tainted by the horrors that had transpired under their roof. Deline, consumed by her delusions, would never understand the full gravity of what she had done. In her twisted mind, she was still fulfilling a divine purpose. But for Ezekiel, the sanctity of his family was destroyed, and there was no salvation in sight. The following days would see the unraveling of the Holloway family play out in full view of the town, a reckoning that left Cordova grappling with the depths of human depravity and the lengths people would go in the name of misguided faith. Death would ripple through the community, leaving a trail of devastation and questions that would haunt them all. In the days that followed, the Holloway household was a place of mourning, but also of intense scrutiny. News of the incident spread like wildfire through Cordova, and with it came a deluge of gossip and speculation. Neighbors whispered in hushed tones, piecing together fragments of a story that was still too fresh and raw for anyone to fully comprehend. Ezekiel, now a shell of the man he once was, became a figure of both pity and condemnation. Jeremiah was consumed by guilt. The boy who had once been vibrant and full of life now felt as if he were trapped in a waking nightmare. His mother's twisted interpretations of faith had led them down this dark path, and the knowledge that he had participated in her delusions made it impossible for him to find solace. He couldn't bring himself to face his father, nor could he escape the memories of that fateful night. The violence, the blood, the look of shock in Ezekiel's eyes. Ezekiel, meanwhile, was left to grapple with the monstrous reality of what had transpired. He had loved Deline deeply, had trusted her with his heart and home. The betrayal cut deeper than he could have imagined. He began to question everything: their marriage, the way he had raised Jeremiah, the life they had built together. The guilt of his actions clawed at him incessantly, even as he tried to convince himself that he had acted in the heat of the moment. But how could he ever justify the taking of a life, especially that of the woman he had vowed to love and protect? As the police investigation unfolded, the media descended upon Cordova, eager to exploit the tragedy for sensational headlines. The story of the Holloway family became a grim spectacle, dissected and debated across talk shows and news segments. Questions of mental illness, religious fanaticism, and domestic abuse became focal points, leaving little room for the complex reality of what had occurred. Ezekiel faced the consequences of that night with a mix of horror and resignation. He was arrested and charged with manslaughter, the weight of the accusation hanging over him like a dark cloud. The trial became a public trial of morality, as experts weighed in on the psychological aspects of familial bonds gone awry. Ezekiel sat in the courtroom, surrounded by strangers who scrutinized him, seeking to understand the unthinkable. In the midst of the chaos, Jeremiah became the collateral damage in a war of public perception. The boy was caught between his father's reckoning and the fallout from his mother's actions. Friends turned away, unable to process the tragedy that had unfolded. He was left isolated, navigating a world that felt fundamentally changed, shattered by secrets and betrayal. The nights were the hardest for Ezekiel. In the solitude of his cell, he replayed the events over and over again, seeking answers that remained elusive. He thought of Deline's laughter, the way she had cared for him and their son, and then the nightmare of her last moments. Was there a way to reconcile the two halves of her? Could he ever forgive himself? As the trial loomed closer, the community of Cordova held its breath, torn between sympathy for a man who had suffered a terrible loss and horror at the violent end of a once loving family. The truth of what had happened in the Holloway home was a puzzle that no one could solve, and the scars would run deep for everyone involved. On the day of the trial, the courtroom was packed. Reporters jostled for position, and the air buzzed with anticipation. Ezekiel sat at the defendant's table, flanked by his attorney, feeling the weight of the world pressing down upon him. He knew that he had to tell his side of the story, the truth that had been buried beneath layers of grief and despair. As he took the stand, he looked out at the sea of faces, many of whom he had known for years. He could see the judgment in their eyes, but also a flicker of compassion. He took a deep breath and began to speak, his voice steady despite the emotional storm raging within him. "I loved her," he said, the words tumbling out, raw and honest. "I loved Deline with everything I had. I thought I knew her. I thought we were a family. But in those last months, something changed. She became someone I didn't recognize. I didn't see the signs. I was blind to the truth." Tears streamed down his face as he recounted the days leading up to that terrible night. He spoke of the growing distance between him and his son, of Deline's increasingly erratic behavior, and of the moments that had haunted him since, the signs he had missed. "I wish I could take it all back," he choked out, his voice breaking. "I wish I could bring her back. But I can't. All I can do is face what I've done." In the audience, Jeremiah watched his father, feeling a mix of anguish and sympathy. He understood in that moment that they were both victims of the same twisted fate. Both had loved Deline, both had lost her, and both would carry the scars of that night for the rest of their lives. As the trial unfolded, it became clear that the events in the Holloway home were not merely a story of betrayal, but a cautionary tale of the dangers of fanaticism, the complexities of love, and the fragility of family. The judgment would not simply determine Ezekiel's fate, but would echo through the lives of everyone connected to the Holloway family, leaving them to navigate the aftermath of tragedy in a world forever altered by the storm that had torn them apart. The aftermath of Ezekiel's sentencing rippled through the community, leaving the town of Cordova grappling with the fallout of a tragedy that had shattered its collective sense of security. While some residents expressed relief at the verdict, believing justice had been served, others felt a profound sense of loss, mourning not only the death of Deline, but also the family that had once been a cornerstone of their community. Jeremiah, now forced to confront the reality of his new life, found himself navigating the complexities of trauma and recovery. His aunt, a kind but strict woman, provided a safe haven, yet the walls of her home felt like a prison. Despite the safety, Jeremiah struggled with feelings of betrayal and guilt. He had loved his mother deeply, even as her actions twisted their relationship into something dark and suffocating. Mental health professionals worked diligently with him, helping him untangle the web of manipulation that had ensnared him for so long. Days turned into weeks, and Jeremiah began to piece together a semblance of normalcy. He enrolled in community college, but each lecture, each social interaction was a reminder of what he had lost. Friends he had once known distanced themselves, unsure of how to approach him or what to say. The silence of his isolation was deafening, but it was in those quiet moments that he began to reflect on his mother's influence and the dynamics that had shaped his childhood. Meanwhile, the Holloway family story became a sensational topic in local and national media. Documentaries and news segments dissected every detail, painting Ezekiel as a man pushed to the brink and Deline as a tragic figure lost in her own delusions. The trial had revealed uncomfortable truths about the nature of faith, family loyalty, and the hidden darkness that can lurk behind even the most loving facades. Conversations about mental health, parental control, and the effects of trauma flooded public discourse, forcing many to confront their own perceptions of morality and justice. Ezekiel, in prison, faced the weight of his actions every day. The stark reality of his surroundings contrasted sharply with the life he had once known. He was surrounded by men grappling with their own demons, some guilty of heinous crimes far worse than his. It was a harsh environment, and while he found solace in books and the occasional visit from his lawyer, the loneliness was often overwhelming. Each day was a reminder of the love he had lost, and the bond with Jeremiah that now felt irrevocably damaged. As months turned into years, both father and son began to embark on their individual journeys of healing. Jeremiah, with the support of therapists and newfound friendships, learned to express his feelings rather than suppress them. He delved into his studies, focusing on psychology, a field that resonated with his own experiences. He felt a calling to help others who had suffered similar traumas, seeking to understand the nuances of mental health and the complexities of family dynamics. Ezekiel, too, found a form of redemption within the prison walls. He participated in group therapy sessions, where he began to understand the roots of his anger and the depth of his pain. He realized that his path to forgiveness, both of himself and of Deline, would be a long and arduous journey. Through writing and reflection, he came to terms with the mistakes he had made, not only in the heat of that fateful night, but throughout his life. In time, the possibility of parole approached, and Ezekiel prepared himself for a reunion that filled him with trepidation. The thought of seeing Jeremiah again both terrified and excited him. He knew that their relationship would never be the same. The shadows of the past would linger, yet he clung to the hope that they could rebuild, even if it meant starting from the ground up. When the day finally arrived, Jeremiah stood outside the prison gates, heart racing. He had wrestled with his emotions for months, trying to reconcile the love he felt for his father with the pain of betrayal and loss. As he saw Ezekiel emerge, a part of him wanted to run and hide, but another part yearned for connection. The two men stood silently for a moment, each grappling with their own emotions. Ezekiel's eyes were filled with remorse, and Jeremiah could see the toll that time had taken on him. The years in prison had aged him prematurely, but the love that remained in his gaze was unmistakable. "I'm so sorry," Ezekiel said, his voice breaking, "for everything. I know I can never take back what happened, but I'm here now. I want to make things right." Jeremiah swallowed hard, a knot forming in his throat. "I don't know if things can ever be right again," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I want to try. I want to understand." With that tentative step forward, the two embraced, each feeling the weight of their shared pain and the flicker of hope for a new beginning. It would take time, therapy, and an unwavering commitment to rebuilding trust. But for the first time in years, they could see a path ahead, one that held the possibility of healing and understanding, even amidst the scars that would never fully fade. As they began to navigate their new relationship, the town of Cordova continued to move forward, forever marked by the tragedy that had unfolded within the Holloway household. The community sought to rebuild its trust in one another, recognizing the fragility of family and the importance of understanding the darkness that can lurk in the corners of even the most loving homes. Ezekiel and Jeremiah's journey toward healing mirrored the town's own path to recovery, a reminder that, while the past can never be changed, the future remains unwritten, waiting to be filled with the hope of redemption, understanding, and love.